Hello, everyone. We're back with Peak Human. I'm doing another live intro. Please watch this on YouTube. It's on the Food Lies YouTube channel. I'm doing it live so I can show my new products. This nose to tail amazing soap we do, beef tallow. I got my nose to tail biltong. Talk about those a little bit later, but I wanted to introduce my guest today, Richard Perkins. He's an amazing regenerative rancher. He's a regenerative agriculture specialist. He wrote the book. The book is called Regenerative Agriculture. He's a teacher. He's up in Sweden doing amazing things. He lives this every day. He's been doing this for decades. He lives basically on all his own food with his family, and they produce enough for themselves and for their community, and they sell it as well. But his main job is to travel around the world and teach people about regenerative ag, permaculture, holistic management, all the good stuff. He's his pals with Alan Savory and Joel Salatin and doing all the good work and continuing on where they left off. So I highly recommend this episode. He talks a lot about his own diet, about how to eat to be healthy, to eat seasonally, to eat off the land, to eat locally. What does that mean? Is he getting mangoes? I don't think so. He's getting animal foods. He's getting local plant foods. He's living very well, living very healthy. So please check this one out. I had a great time talking to him. And now back to nose to tail. This is how this podcast works. This is how I stay alive. This is how my ranchers pay their rent. This is how I pay my rent. This is the best win-win ever. We make amazing products and we get them straight to you. You can go to nosetotale.org and order one of our product line from one of our product lines. We have 5 of them. We have the fresh meat with 5 animals. We have pork, chicken, bison, lamb, and beef, all regeneratively raised, pasture raised, corn-free, soy-free, organic, the whole deal. These animals are wild crafted. They're out eating what they're supposed to eat. They're not eating a monoculture diet. They're getting a diverse array of foods and grasses and forages and living like they should. And this is why the meat is so healthy. So you can get that. You can get an entire box of it shipped to you. You can get the primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. You can get a low PUFA fed pork and chicken. Get it all. Check it out on our site. We also have the body care products. We're so close to ramping these up so we don't sell out. Right now we have a bit of them left. We have the soap and some lip balm left. We're out of the skin food. We are going to have deodorant and hair care soon. Very excited about that. I use all this stuff daily. I got the samples. I got the sneak peek. We also have the seasonings to go with the meat. And we have the biltong. I got a package right here. We're remaking a batch of livervores right now. That's the stick version of drovores. It has liver in it. It's a great way to get liver on the go. Just check out all our products at nosetotale.org. You can't go wrong. Get them shipped straight to you. We're working on international shipping. And if you want to support the show in other ways, you can share it with a friend. You can give it a review on iTunes or any other podcast app. I'd recommend starting back at episode 1. So many great episodes out there. You can also go to sapien.org, join the newsletter, follow me, Food Lies, on any social media platform. And let's get on to the show with Richard Perkins. Hey, we're live with Richard Perkins up in Sweden. How are you doing today?
Great. Yeah, great to be with you, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Yeah, you've gotten recommended to me by multiple listeners, and I checked out your YouTube channel. You got a lot going on there, doing amazing stuff. Where are you exactly? What do you do, and where did you grow up?
So I'm actually from the UK. I'm from a small rural village in the southwest of England. And so I went to ag school in the UK when I was still a teenager, and I always had this vision to farm. And I left ag school with more questions than answers. It seemed like that field hadn't really evolved over decades. And I went on learning journey around the world looking at pioneering folks who were farming properly, like in with respect to animals and the landscape to produce really nutrient dense food. And that's really been a core part of my journey, is to create the sort of conditions and atmosphere that I would like to raise my own children in. And so I've had a quite a long varied career within that, designing a lot of properties and building up my own farm here in Sweden. But I didn't expect to find myself here in a more conservative, more expensive, colder place than the UK, really. So I'm up at 59 degrees north. It's, for reference, that's the same latitude as Magadan in Russia, or I think Fritz Creek in Alaska, if that means anything to anyone. It's pretty far north. It's very challenging conditions to farm in. It's very short growing season here. We get 3 months without frost and pretty dark throughout the winter. And that's actually a benefit. We get a long break over the winter time and a pretty hectic summertime. So I'm kind of in the triangle between Oslo, Stockholm, and Gothenburg in a fairly remote village setting, you could say.
That's great. Maybe not as remote as Frederick, the Sami reindeer herder, who I had on a couple years ago. But you're up there, man. Yeah, Alaska. People will know Alaska at least. So that, that's up north. And yeah, I wanted to talk to you about regenerative ag for sure, about food production, but also about diet. Like, how are you living up there? How do humans live in the past? Right? Like a lot of our ancestors went through Northern Europe, right? And they lived through these times or through ice ages. I think I first got turned on to you by your sort of challenge to yourself, which I think you've already do anyway, is just grow all your own food that you eat, or for a whole year just eat only from your farm, which is what you do mostly anyway. But it's sort of not a Whole Foods cornucopia of fruits and vegetables. We'll put it that way. Whole
Sure.
Foods as in
Well,
the store, the market Whole Foods, but yes, it would be all Whole Foods.
yeah. It's a really interesting question. We can unpack a bit. I mean, it's interesting anthropologically speaking as well. It's clear to me that modern civilization as we know it came about through the surpluses created by animals, like farming animals, essentially. It's only when we had draft animals that could pull plows and things like this, and animals that we could milk and take skin and hide from, as well as protein, that we could really move a lot further north and south from the equator, with all the ancient civilizations, being much further south along the equator. But it really struck me moving to Sweden is like, wow, people must have lived on the edge here. Like the threat of starvation was never very far away, and one bad season of growing would have meant you could only survive on animal-based products. And I think that's still alive in the cuisine. Obviously, like Sweden is heavily reliant on imported food today, but still part of their traditional thoroughfare would have been just meat and potatoes. I mean, there wouldn't have been, other than a little bit of barley and a little bit of oats, like it's really meat and potato country, and people would have eaten a lot of fatty meat here for sure. So I've always been on a bit of a quest myself with diet and tried. I was brought up vegetarian actually. I never ate
Uh-oh.
meat really until I was in my early teenage years. And when I left home quite young, I started eating a lot more meat. And I've always, in tandem with studying agriculture, I've been studying anthropology and physiology and all of these integrated things about what led us to where we are now and what are optimal ways to do all those things. I've been very much focused on what is optimal ways to farm that builds soil and habitat and creates epic quality food for people locally. But within that, it's been a journey into my own well-being and state of mind. I've had a heavy workload for 15, 20 years, and that's brought on its own stresses. And I've been faced with some personal injuries from my teenage years that were causing me problems with my work through sort of inflammatory things. So that led me to exploring a lot more animal intensive diets. And I've been on a bit of a journey with that for the last maybe 3 years. I think for the last decade, I've always been working with intermittent fasting and long periods of actual fasting. And even though I'm sort of known as I guess I'm known in my field as a holistic farmer. We're producing animal products, but we're also producing tree crops, berry crops, and vegetables. I've never I've never eaten so many vegetables, and I've always had this kind of feeling, looking anthropologically, historically, that hey, these are foods that we did not eat for more than the last 2,000 years. They didn't exist, not a single one. Like an iceberg lettuce, sort of protoplasmic mush that basically has very little nutrition. I mean, this was a poisonous wayside plant in the Roman times. So it shows you how intensely the breeding has been done on these sort of plants. And it's always made me think, because vegetables, although we grow them here and I teach people how to grow them, I've had this sort of awkward relationship with them, because I feel like these are things that are not vital. They're hard to keep alive, actually. You have to do an incredible amount of work to keep them alive. And so I've always been interested in foraging as well. And Sweden's an incredible country for harvesting wild yields. We have incredible nutrient dense berries like the blueberries in the forests and wild mushrooms. And that always struck me. I mean, even with raising livestock like cows and sheep, etc., we're going out 6 in the morning to move the livestock in the morning. They're on a constantly moving basis around the farm. And then I'd see a bunch of deer or an elk walk past, what you call a moose, I guess, and just thinking to myself, I need to do a hunting license, because the amount of work we're doing to produce meat here, when there's just animals walking out the forest at us, it's crazy. So I got more into that. And then I think over the last few years, as more and more people have dug into this sort of carnivore diets or carnivore-ish diets, paleo things, all of these things that have become a lot more under the spotlight, and a lot more people are starting to ask the right questions and really start a new level of research and analysis with these things. It really caught my attention, because it sits well with me from a pattern perspective. When I look back at how humans developed through time and culture, it makes total sense to me. And I think just listening to a lot of podcasts and things has given me the confidence to just forget what anyone else says, and go for what I feel intuitively in many senses. So I've been on a purely animal-based diet, and for me, that's based around my farm. So here at the farm, for context, I'm producing beef with heritage hardy Swedish cattle that live outside all winter and are, pretty small but very robust animals. We produce sheep, we produce forest-raised pigs. We're very focused on raising animals in their natural habitat, and forest raised pig is that's the habitat of wild boar, pigs, etc. And producing meat chickens, turkeys, and then producing eggs, and then producing some soft fruits like berry fruits. And up here at this high latitude, because we get such long summer sunlight, you get much higher levels of vitamins and riboflavins, things like that. So the berry and herb production is kind of world famous here, because it's super nutrient dense. So I have agroforestry on my farm. That's just putting rows of trees into the pasture where the animals move in between. And that supplies, I have a freezer full of berry fruit that will last me until the next crop come. And obviously, having livestock on the farm, I have a certified slaughtery on the farm. That's for small game like chickens, geese, turkeys. But I can use that space for slaughtering bigger animals for myself. So we're unusual as a farm, because we produce commercial crops for sale, but then we produce all of our own food needs as well. Whereas most farms, like if you say the word farm, most people probably picture vast fields of monocultures or big herds of cattle. And that's really not what I call farming. That's the sort of work of a technician. That's often someone producing a commodity crop that they're exporting off the farm, and then they go to the store and buy all their food in. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to produce all my family food first and then produce certain things for sale. So we have this benefit where by slaughtering animals on the farm, we get to keep all of the good bits, all of the fats, all of the intestines and offal, and can make products with those. And I'm sure many of your listeners will know the benefits of eating nose to tail. So that's a really big part of my food journey. And so at any point, I've got several freezers, chest freezers full of meat, but also a dedicated freezer that's full of beef liver and heart and spleen and all these things that where the real nutrient density is. And also something I noticed by working with slaughteries around here is that when a large animal like a cow or something is slaughtered, a lot of the fat is thrown away. Like probably 50, 60% of the fat is thrown away. And when I put an animal through like most of a carcass will go to mince, right? And then you have your fine cuts and stewing cuts, etc. But I make sure all the fat goes in because I'm really thriving off fat. So I went on to a fully carnivore diet about 2 years ago. But there are periods in my life where I have to break from this because, for social reasons, I think it's a pretty antisocial diet. And there's times when I'm not on my farm that I'm interacting with people in very different circumstances. Then I'll relax my diet because it just feels way easier than like trying to talk to people at a restaurant about my strange habits. But then more recently, I introduced some carbohydrates again. So before I was just eating mostly fat and meat, but then some eggs, a little bit of dairy. And in the more recent months, I've introduced carbohydrates in the way of honey and certain fruits, and particularly berry fruits, which I turn into like smoothies with honey and things in a blender and have my supply here. So I'd say now I'm sort of mostly animal focused, mostly meat and fat, with some amount of eggs and dairy, just as I feel for it, and then some berries and some honey. And basically all of that I can get from my farm, except I don't have bees at the moment. So next spring I'll be getting bees again. We're so far north that bees are a challenge because however well you treat them, it's often that you will lose a hive just because of the cold weather here, and that's quite common. So we used to have bees, but
Mhm.
don't have them any longer.
Well, soon enough. That sounds like an incredible diet. Sounds delicious. Sounds very ancestral. I went to Africa recently, and it seemed like that's what they ate. They had the meat, the fat, the nose, the tail, organs, all that, and then they would get some berries when they found them, and honey when they found it. That was what they had. They also had tubers. So, are you including any tubers?
No, I don't feel the need to in any way. I think when I went on to just strict animal only, and when I say animal only, I'm including eggs and dairy, and
Hmm.
was eating a lot of butter then. And I found like the impact. I think I got burnt out from working too much. Alongside the farm, I'm also writing books and leading education programs and kind of burning the candle at both ends, you could say. A couple of years ago, I got a bit burnt out, and that's what led me to go very strictly onto that diet. And with an element of intermittent fasting, I tend to eat like a big meal at 11 in the morning and then a big meal 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and
Hmm.
that's all I'm eating in the day. And I had this brain fog. My friend had always described this brain fog to me, and I never knew what he was talking about, but I really got it when I got exhausted and I couldn't remember like the names or places of things that I was talking about in a class that I've said 1,000 times before, and just this feeling of my brain is not working properly. And also, I noticed like I'd had quite a sedentary year because I was going on a tour around Europe to film and interview all of the past students that have come through our farm learning. And I really wanted to record that and put it onto YouTube to inspire others that are starting up. And because of COVID, I couldn't actually go. So I ended up sitting around doing most of that tour digitally via Zoom. And
Hmm.
so I had quite a sedentary year compared to, hard graft on the farm. And I noticed like a little bit of belly fat that comes as you get a bit older, and
Hmm.
and I could attribute that purely to carbs. And within, I think it was within 5 or 6 weeks of going on to animal-based diet, I just slimmed down and my muscles got harder again, and I was back to what I weighed ever since I was, 20 or so. I'm approaching 40 now. And my brain got sharp again and my brain fog disappeared and I felt really, really great. But after maybe 3 months of that, I started to notice like I don't know if it's heart palpitations,
Mm.
but just feeling my heartbeat a lot more in
Mhm.
my rib cage. And it worried me a bit. I didn't really know what was going on, but I remember hearing some podcasts about it and reintroduced a little bit of fruit sugars and honey, and that immediately solved that for me, and I started feeling really great. So that's what I've stuck with, and I don't really feel I'm lacking anything regarding starchy carbohydrates like tubers, anything like that. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
potato would be the obvious one up here. That's pretty much the only starchy root crop that people would have survived on, but I haven't missed it at all. So
Well, there's no need if if you're doing great. So yeah, I guess the conclusion of that is you have found this way of eating, you feel great, you feel like you've resolved any symptoms, and is that the case? You're just doing well?
yeah, totally. And sleep a lot better, and don't get tired throughout the day. And I just feel like I haven't done much. I'm sure some of your listeners are much more scientifically engaged with like blood work and these kind of things. And I haven't been so engaged with that. I'm going really with how I feel. And, and I just make sure that I eat a lot of organ meats. And I think that's really super important for vitamins, nutrient density. And then I've got this incredible benefit of I'm eating things that I've raised. So I'm not needing to go to a store and buy some liver that was, possibly taken, I don't know how many days ago and refrigerated for how long. I mean, these are things that I'm sure you experienced yourself in Africa. Like when any animal is hunted, the liver is taken and eaten raw straight away.
Oh yeah.
So I do a thing here. We eat raw liver, and I actually have a chicken slaughtery that I mentioned before. Like it's actually the rite of passage for people that are. There's not many farms where you can go and be trained in how to uh, kill and eviscerate animals for markets. It's like a legally approved place that people can come and learn so that they can go and do it themselves. And part of their initiate rights are making sure they eat raw liver. And yeah, it's really I think that's a super important element and something that I've tried to spread into the customer base for the farm too, is responsible eating. And I think that's something that I'd like to share with your listeners too, is like a lot of people, especially people going into carnivore diets or meat based diets, is, it's very tempting to go for steaks and, these lovely cuts of meat. But really, I think there's another level to that where if we want to see landscapes being well managed and restored, and we want to see healthy humans and local food systems, resilient food systems, then we have to remember to not only eat nose to tail, but also to eat like in terms of proportional appropriateness. So, for example, a cow, when you kill a cow, you lose half of that weight in the viscera and the skin and the hooves. And by the time you actually take out the bones and you have trimmed meat, you've got maybe 40% of that animal left. But what's most important is if you're going to eat beef, 7 out of 10 meals is going to be mince, essentially. And hopefully, if you know your butcher or know your farmer, then you can make sure all of that fat is put into that mince because most of it's thrown away typically. And we've got a whole, generation of people scared about animal fat when really that's the prize bit of it. So
Making a
seven
whole
out of
film
ten
about it,
meals,
yeah.
yeah, nice. Seven out of 10 meals should be mince, and then 2 out of 10 should be like slow cooked stews and things like that. And it's only one meal out of 10 that's steaks, and that would be anatomically appropriate way to eat an animal. And then obviously you've got your organs on top. But I've also got this feeling, part of my sort of learning journey into my diet has been thinking about how adaptable the human body must have been. Like, for example, eggs. If we found eggs, we would have only found eggs in spring, and we would have eaten 20 eggs in one sitting, maybe for a few weeks, and then we wouldn't have seen them again till the next year. And I feel like that's the case with things like organ meats. Like, if you kill an animal, then you eat all those precious um, organ meats pretty much immediately, if possible, because that's when they're most nutrient dense, when they're totally fresh. And then a lot of the nutrient in there is stored in the body that you don't need to eat that on a daily basis. That's And I think that's something that we've forgotten, this 3 meal a day thing and eating the same sort of nutrition every day. I don't think that that's how we evolved. And the body, obviously, certainly with my experience through pretty extreme fasting when I was younger, it's like the body is designed for that kind of stress and sort of high influx of nutrition and then periods without influx. And I guess it's different if you're doing a lot of high intensity working out and this kind of thing. You need a different level of fuel. But I think there's something in there that's worth exploring too.
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah, it's like feast and fast, and I don't think we need to be extreme and like try to mimic our ancestors exactly. But
Sure.
yeah, I think people do have the wrong idea about how to eat. But I also see both sides of it too. I mean, it's sometimes it's easier to just split up the organ meats, and I'm going to eat a little bit each week or a little bit each day, and you can get into some routines. But then you're right. Your body knows how to store things, and you can just top up every month, and maybe that's more appropriate. And also, just eating seasonally is more appropriate, even with the
Totally.
berries and the honey too, and anything. And yeah, I think the main message is how far we've gone away from just the way we used to eat and the way we used to grow food, which we'll transition into soon. But the way we used to eat is just so different. Even back to the vegetables, like yeah, these weren't all around. All of the brassicas just came from the same like wild mustard plant, right? This like spindly little like thing with no calories that could have been toxic even. And then we've gotten all of what we have today. And I like what you said about how hard it is to just grow a head of lettuce. I mean, that if you're talking about how we survived for hundreds of thousands of years, like we just have this view that it's just you show up to the Whole Foods market and they're all just there. But if something was so hard to grow and it yielded such few calories, like a head of lettuce is crunchy water, basically, like we wouldn't do that. It doesn't even make sense. Even if we did have it, why would we spend so much time and effort on it? That's not no one we didn't have nutritionists telling us we had to eat the rainbow and you need to eat like 10 colors of fruits and vegetables each day. Like we're like, no, we eat what we have and we eat so that we feel good and stay healthy. And humans observed, they're very observant of trends and like, whoa, this guy ate a lot of this and the woman did too, and they had such a healthy kid. And then this person, they're eating all the grains, and this, their kids' teeth are falling out. you know.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah,
totally.
humans are really observant, and and then one more thing, as you're talking about not doing all the blood work again. We didn't need blood work. If you're eating like you're doing, I think you have the perfect diet. I'm pretty much where you're at. I will eat some sweet potatoes and maybe some white rice now and then. But I mean, yeah, I'm all about the nose to tail animal foods, the fruits, some honey. I do fermented vegetables. I don't really eat like plain vegetables. I'll eat some fermented vegetables, which is a better way to prepare them, get some of the
Mm,
anti-nutrients out, all kinds of stuff
mm.
like that. More traditional methods that we would have used. But yeah, we don't need to do all these blood tests. We thrived and much more than survives for hundreds of thousands of years to get here as humans without a single blood test.
Yeah, it's a nice way to put it. I think it's worth saying, like in plants' defense, because I mean, I've always enjoyed growing vegetables. I just never particularly enjoyed eating them. What I have noticed is that I enjoy eating random leaves in the garden when I'm walking around, but I do not like prepared salads and I do not like cooked vegetables very much. And that aside, I think humans obviously ate plants in all different cultures whenever they could, but as possibly more as medicine and sometimes obviously for calories, but it's worth that it's worth really thinking that if you look at you can buy a book on harvesting wild foods and herbs and they're readily available for most countries that everyone listening to is living in. And I've done a lot of that in the past. And, obviously you get some of the highlights like wild strawberries and wild blueberries, but most of the sort of wild leaves and stems or shoots that people gather for eating are incredibly nutrient dense, incredibly bitter, which is a taste profile that most people don't even experience anymore. But you can see just instinctively that people did not eat a lot of those. I'm sure we used to eat plants, but we didn't eat a plateful of plants. We'd have eaten a few bitter leaves probably, and as a nutritional supplement or a medicinal sort of supplement. I certainly think people, as we left the equator and lived further north and south, then people obviously relied primarily on fat for their calories. And it's just very interesting also to look anthropologically back at the history of grain production, which came out of the area as far back as we can see, came from an area in Jordan called Tra, where the oldest granaries were found. And it was only a result of radical changing climate that led people to settle down near water and start growing grains, which at those times were tiny, tiny little seeds. Hardly, you can hardly imagine how they could have sustained themselves from that. And it's interesting if you look back at the archaeological evidence from places like ancient Egypt, places that survived on these high grain diets, they had every single all cause mortality that we have today, which we see in their mummy records, etc. So it's in a way you could say that farming has brought us way more problems than good in some ways.
Oh, that's why Jared Diamond says the greatest mistake in human history. And yeah, in my film, we're back in that section looking at the mummies, and they had atherosclerosis, they had type 2 diabetes. Basically, they were overweight, they had joint pain, they had messed up teeth, they had all the same problems. And people, it's funny that the vegan film, I remember the Game Changers, they were trying to use that as an example. They're like, oh, the Rome, what was it? What's it called? The gladiators ate a
Mhm.
grain-based diet. I'm like, yeah, they were fat and they were like slaves basically, and they gave them the cheapest thing ever, and they were all sick back then. Like, what's your point?
Yeah. Yeah, and they were also taken from their cultures and probably force-fed that diet. So their pre-existing athleticism was not based upon that, perhaps. It's
Yeah,
complex, right? These are, I steer clear of these kind of films, and it's too easy to get lost in either way. But I think it's very obvious looking from an agricultural perspective and an anthropological perspective. It's things like refined grains, sugars, refined oils are clearly noxious and not part of our ancient agriculture in any way. So, and
well,
I think
that's it.
most people are getting clear that these are pretty easy things to eliminate and still be able to eat quite a wide variety of things.
Yeah, most people, as in the people listening, the small percentage of people that are actually paying attention. The problem is we're not the majority. It's super obvious to everyone listening, and people who actually understand health. But really, you got to look at the mass scale of people, and they still don't get it. And yeah, that's one of the things I want to talk to you about. Is well, we just eat the most empty calories. I like that could be the biggest problem in the world is how we raise the empty calories and the fact that we eat the empty calories. And the empty calories are from the three things you listed: the refined grains, the refined sugars, and the refined oils. And that's it. That's like all of our problems, all of our healthcare problems, $1 trillion healthcare bills,
Hmm.
all these problems with society. It all stems from trying to rely on these foods that don't give us nourishment. And I was trying to think of a analogy to it. I don't know if I did a good enough job, but I mean, I was just thinking of like a spaceship. If we all rely, like in the future, we're all just have our personal spaceship, and it takes this like jet fuel, and it's expensive, and but it's good, like we mine it from the ground, and this is like what we need. Then someone comes along with this cheap, just garbage alternative that they made in a factory and they refined, and it's like half the price. And so then everyone just starts using that. Right. And it's just like, well, I don't know, it's cheap and it like works. And I don't know. And I just use it. And then all these spaceships start breaking down and no one's like, hey, what about the real fuel? What are we doing here? But it's this the government's pushing it. Everyone out there in the mainstream is just pushing the doctors. All these studies are funded by big food companies trying to say, hey,
Sure.
use the refined, sugar, oil, this stuff. It's all healthy. Don't worry. Just count your calories. Just exercise more. I just saw a post about how much Coca-Cola paid off different industry research to
Mm.
try to show that You should just move more. Oh, it's just about exercising. Don't worry about your calories or your food. You just got to move more. All this stuff, every problem, pretty much, you could stem from eating a bunch of empty foods.
Totally. I mean, people are probably not aware the full extent of the power of the lobbying of agricultural boards on governments. I mean, it's huge. You could think of 1,000 examples. You know, the milk marketing board, the orange growers in California, and oranges being like, if you say to most primary school kids, you know, what's a good source of vitamin C? They'll say oranges. Oranges are a pathetic source of vitamin C. That's all just straight down from lobbying back in the 60s, I believe it was, in California. And that's,
What would
you
be a
couldn't,
better berries?
berries, but like animal foods could be a much better source of
Well,
that
yeah, you
too.
could some liver, some fresh liver for sure.
Yeah. But yes, there are, you know, there's a lot more. I always found it pretty interesting. I think in Sweden 2 years ago, I'm blessed. I mean, another part of my diet that I didn't mention is I also fish and hunt and fish for lobster. I collect oyster and fish for mackerel and sea trout on the west coast. And I also hunt deer, and there's wild boar and elk here. And then we gather a lot of the berry fruits. We have lingonberry, it's a little red cowberry, maybe it's called there, as well as blueberry. But though I think they estimated, I heard it on the Swedish radio a couple of years ago, they estimated there would be 50 million tons of blueberries that wouldn't get collected in the forest. And people are collecting it commercially already, you know. 50 million tons of berries that wouldn't be collected, and yet you see the ever-growing superfood industry of like acai berries from
Mhm.
South America in the supermarkets and this kind of thing. It's, you know, people have forgotten the resource base that's around them. And I think not only from a nutrition standpoint, we talked about eating seasonally, like there's something joyful and grounding about being connected to the season. And I'm very fortunate as a farmer and the steward of my landscape is I'm totally intimately tied to those rhythms of the cycles, etc. But there's something so akin to well-being in there where you look forward to lobster fishing season. That's like 6 weeks here, or hunting season, or now's the first time we harvest berries or collect mushrooms, or those little cycles that tie us into the landscape. It's so important on a psychological level, not just on the physiological level.
And nutritionally, yeah, and this is why I think we have a problem with anti-nutrients in plants too, right? People have these problems because they're eating the spinach year round. That's not what we did. You wouldn't have a huge problem with the oxalates if you didn't just eat stuff year round. So it's super important for so many reasons. So maybe we just talk more about your farm. It's not even that big yet. It's very productive. You have books, you have classes, you go around the world when it's not COVID teaching. And I watched a lecture you did, a presentation. I don't know if it was in England. So basically, your whole life is revolved around teaching people how to grow food in the correct way. How did we do it ancestrally? How did we do it holistically? And I'll just throw in. You said it before. We separate everything. We have you said we have a big bunch of cows and then we have a big bunch of monocrops. It's basically we've never done it like that. It's always mixed. So yeah, why don't you tell us more about your property?
Well, let's go back a step first to you're talking about empty calories. So, what is modern farming? Modern farming is getting bigger and bigger, like less people on the land, using more and more technology and machinery, incurring higher and higher debts to produce fewer and fewer diversity of crops, and they're working in an extractive manner. So, they're using a credit card system. They're taking their soil resources and using that extractively, and then when their farms, you know, can't produce without chemical applications, and they've robbed the future of that landscape, they tell their sons and daughters, hey, don't go into farming. The business sucks. go to the city, get a real job. The average age of farmers here in Sweden is about 65. That's the same in the United States. It's the same in most Western countries. And we have this fundamental problem where the older farmers can't afford to get out of farming because all of their capital is locked up in massive debt based infrastructure. And therefore, young people can't afford to buy in. So that we're losing this knowledge in a couple of generations of people that know how to steward landscapes. It's very easy to sit and bash conventional farming, but we all rely fundamentally upon it pretty much. I mean, unless we're producing all our food ourselves, we're reliant on it. So we've got to be careful because there's a lot of incredible knowledge and wisdom in that community. It's just been thwarted and manipulated by a globalized food system and a lack of education. People at agriculture school aren't taught about how ecosystems around them function. So if I want to raise cattle, I need to look at how wild herbivores acted in nature. Trouble is, we don't see that anymore. So when Europeans first went to North America, there were 60 to 100 million bison running around the plains. Now, the most glorious thing you might see is on National Geographic, you might see 5,000 wildebeest, and that seems like a spectacle, but that's not 100 million. How far away could you hear those animals coming from? You know, and what sort of impact did that have on the landscape? Well, the sort of impact it had on the landscape was grasses so tall that you could tie them in knots above the saddle of your horse. And roots that went 9 meters deep into the ground. And wherever a plant is putting roots into the soil, it's photosynthesizing, producing sugars and proteins that it's putting into the soil that stimulates the soil food web, the life, the bacteria, the fungi. This is the process of capturing carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into the subsoil where it belongs, because carbon in the soil is holding water and it's allowing plants to thrive in dry seasons, and it's stopping the soil get compacted, and it's creating that microbial life that creates the health of the grasses, of the buffalo, whatever it is that's feeding on down that chain. So now we took all those animals off the landscape, and you see large areas of North America, for example, that were thriving grasslands with 9 meter deep topsoils. That's brown, rich, carbon rich topsoil, is now desertifying or desert. And all of that carbon in the soil is up in the atmosphere. And we're worried about transportation and flying, etc. And these are all noble things. Oh, we should reduce our fossil fuel use. Yes, maybe we should, but people don't understand that just as much carbon is in our atmosphere from soil depletion as all fossil fuel use ever. So it's a
Well,
massive problem that,
they're talking about cow burps or farts, or you
yeah,
know what I
this
mean?
is a totally reductionist, compartmentalized, linear way of thinking about it. And the trouble is a lot of data is produced from bad farming practices. And so it's very, methane, that's a whole nother question, but there's no problem with methane in grasslands that are healthy. It's just most people have never seen healthy grasslands. So what my farm is about is, well, I ask myself, what sort of future do I want my kids to grow up in? And I'd like them to grow up in a world where towns and villages and even cities are supported by lots of small farms surrounding those communities, providing the food needs right there, in season, locally, nutrient dense, making money for farmers. So I set out on a mission to both design and implement a farm that built soil, produced very good salaries, whilst making better food than you can buy in any store, and at the same time teach a whole new generation of youngsters who are excited to get on the land how to do that effectively. And so that's been my mission. And it's incredible what's spurned out of this project, and it's very doable, but the we need a lot more people getting into farming. It's like the industry solution is, how do we have a 10,000 hectare farm that can produce soybean? But what we need is 1,000 10-hectare farms that produce whole human diets. So I'm a big proponent of mixed farming. So we're producing livestock on permanent pastures, overshaded by trees that are producing us crops and producing benefits for the whole system. And then in our case, we produce vegetables as well. But if you look back on historical farming from several thousand years ago, this is what all farms were. They were mixed with predominantly animals on pasture and tree crops for producing starches or fruits or nuts, etc., and possibly some small amount of vegetables or grains for home needs or whatever. So I guess in my field, that's what I'm known for, is how do we make small farms profitable? And the reason I focus so much on that is that the only way I can convince young people to come and step into farming is if they can earn a city wage living rurally, doing something really meaningful and valuable for their community. And it comes down to money because, why would anyone take what's still a hard job? It's hard physical work, and it's an observation based way of farming. You need to know what you're looking at, and it's got to pay financially as well as in reward for the lifestyle that we have, which, I think it's an impeccable lifestyle too. So I set about to make a farm that will work for, 500 years, 1,000 years. I want to leave the soil in better condition than when I found it. And I want to ultimately measure the success of this farm by how well I can accommodate predator species. And this is maybe a little bit far forward thinking than most people will be used to, but one day we will judge the success of a farm by how fat the predators around it are. Now, it's not to say I'm letting predator species eat my chickens, or, for example, that's not what I'm doing. But when you introduce an animal species to a piece of land, what happens ecologically is you create the niche conditions for 7 other wild species to live there. Right? So everything in nature is totally interconnected and it's working for the benefit of the whole. If I look at the world around me, that's the pattern, the default pattern of everything living on Earth is it's looking after its own needs in the service of the whole because it relies fundamentally on the whole for its well-being and its offspring's being. So on my farm, it's very small but very productive. What happens when you bring a critical mass of many species of animals? So we have 25 acres here. That's about 10 hectares. And in a summer production, which is about 6 or 7 months, we're farming on the pasture, which is about less than 10 acres. We're producing 5,000 meat chickens. We're producing eggs from 1,200 hens. It's about 400,000 eggs. And we're producing $40,000-$50,000 of fruit and berry crops above that pasture too. It's very intensive animal activity, and that's led to building a lot of topsoil that I've documented on YouTube and in my books and things. And it's worth pointing out, there's not many farmers that can say, hey, I build topsoil. Most farmers are mining their topsoil, and we're actually able to demonstrate we've built about 12 inches of topsoil in the first 4 years of this farm by using livestock, because plants and livestock evolved together, or plants and animals more technically evolved together. And then I did a lot of time and motion studies at our farm, so I kept very detailed records of how long does everything take so that we can then make business plans. Because making business plans is quite novel in the farming world, because nearly all farms are propped up by government subsidies. So their businesses don't work. They only work through government handouts. So I specifically don't take any government handouts. I wouldn't be eligible for many because my farm's so small. But I specifically wanted to make a point because the trouble with subsidies is that it means farmers don't have to make responsible decisions anymore. If I'm
Yes.
making creative business, then it's up to me to make ends meet. And so I have to apply creativity. And that's what I'm trying to instill in a new generation of people who are working in what we call regenerative agriculture. So we're trying to leave the farm habitat in a better way than it was, whilst producing food that's of better quality than any store could provide, and having an intimate relationship with our customers. So it's all based on direct marketing. I know all of my customers and I look them in the eye regularly, And that to me is the basis of food security. It's the basis of what makes a community function, you know? And going back to that predator thing, it's worth saying that during the short time, I mean, the farm is going into its ninth season. And in the first 4 years, we showed that we documented a 12-inch growth in our active topsoil. That's measured by the active root mass of the grass plants in the pasture that you can find out if you're interested on YouTube or whatever. That showed itself really dramatically in 2018. We had a record drought. We had 120 days without rain here. And in June, so grass starts growing here about May the 1st. It's very late because we don't really have spring and autumn up this far north. We just have winter nearly all the time, and then there's a bit of summer in the middle, and then it's winter again.
Yeah.
And the grass just starts growing in 1st of May, typically. By the 1st of June, everybody's grass had stopped growing at about 12 to 15 inches tall, and it had gone yellow. We didn't then have rain for the rest of the season. And what happened is all of the farmers around, all over Sweden and the neighboring countries, started selling off half their herds, like half their beef cattle or whatever. And all the slaughtering facilities were instantly fully booked because people could foresee they wouldn't have winter feed like hay or silage or whatever. And there's some fantastic drone footage. I often compare the landscape around the farm to our farm using drones or just with the film camera just to show how our land is changing over time. And at the time in June, when everyone was yellow and stunted out below my kneecaps, we had the same grass species up right up to my eyes in full rapid photosynthesis. And the reason that happened is we've built topsoil from below by using animals to graze grasslands appropriately. And we've built enough carbon into the topsoil that it's storing water like a sponge. And then because we're moving our animals daily to mimic how wild herds of herbivores moved because they were moved around by predator species, that allows plants to recuperate, recover, and put the energy from photosynthesis back into their root reserves. So we're just copying what nature does, and nature tells us how to plant orchard trees. It tells us how to graze animals. It tells us how we can build topsoil, whatever production we're doing. And when we do that, and we do it at a critical mass, like I'm not talking about 5 chickens in my backyard, I'm talking about thousands of chickens passing by several times in the summer, then the landscape changes radically. And because I've used multiple species, all using that same land base multiple times in a year, the ecosystem has changed really quickly. And that's something that anyone can do on any of the major climate zones around the world. And what's beautiful at our farm is we've seen 4 pairs now of apex predators, of breeding raptors, move back onto the farm boundaries. That's 25-acre farm, and we've got 4 pairs of breeding raptors have moved onto the actual farm. And that to me that's my little private proud moment to see them flying around. And
Well, yeah, you came full circle with that because it is hard for people to understand at first why you want predators to be fat, but it's about having a diversified ecosystem. It's kind of the opposite of a monoculture. It's like how do you have success is you have a diversity of plants and animals and tons of insects and birds and this thriving ecosystem. And then yeah, you could support the predators with that thriving ecosystem. And that's why they're there. So that's a good sign.
yeah, you really want that because that's not just a sign. I mean, it's a sign of multiple things going on in the ecosystem. It's a sign that the water cycle is being restored. That means when we get a drought again in a few years, I know I don't have a problem producing because my grassland has become resilient to that. And it means my nutrient cycle is healthy. Like these are, when I look at ecosystems with the ecological training I've had, I can read what's happening in that landscape and it tells me where to put my, because we're using livestock as tools essentially. We're not just using them to produce food and profit, we're using them to drive ecosystem processes through their grazing, which stimulates grasses to build soil by capturing carbon from the atmosphere. It builds the water cycle in the soil. It makes us resilient to droughts and floods. And it's ultimately what leads to nutrient density. So you could say another way I could describe what I do is I'm a microbe farmer. And by putting all of my attention and focus on my microbes in my grassland soil, I can ensure producing the top quality beef that you can buy. And that same thing applies to producing apples or whatever. If we look at where wild apple trees come from in Kazakhstan or Western China and look at how the forest system works there, we can see that it's not just a grass field with a lot of apple trees in, which is how we traditionally plant orchards. So we're just trying to copy nature's patterns. And when we look at those systems, we see that illness is very rare. If you've been lucky enough to go, or any of the listeners have been lucky enough to go to pristine habitats, which are there's not many left on Earth right now, but some of the beautiful uh, rainforests on the western seaboard of Canada and the States, like up in Washington or whatever. If you go into those old growth forests, you'll see sickness and illness are extremely rare. And their only single function is to turn something that's not robust and useful into something that is very it like microbes and pathogens basically are nature's recycling system to turn things that aren't useful into nutrient that's very bioavailable for all the surrounding things to benefit from. It's an incredibly designed system, and yet we have this same we never seem to address core problems. We like to address symptoms. And that's the case in agriculture, education, governance, nutrition, medicine, all
Healthcare.
these
Yeah.
things.
Well, that
Exactly.
okay. The bigger problem, I said the biggest problem is growing and eating empty calories. So one step above that is short-term thinking. So our biggest problem is short-term thinking. So you're talking about long-term thinking, building soil, uh, yeah, leaving it better than you had it, thinking about trees and soil and root structure. This is not rewarded in our current system at all. So everyone's after the short-term thinking and the short-term money. And I love that you're talking about subsidies. It's fake. It's propping it up in a super fake way. You're not actually having a good farm if you're using
Hmm.
subsidies because you're not doing the long-term thinking. But it's the same thing with the healthcare system. You're not having good health if you're just covering up symptoms with pills and and then you have to eat the real food and have the nutrient density, but that's the long-term thinking. People, because yes, in the short term, it is kind of about calories in a way, right? Short term, like in one day, I guess, you could say it's kind of about calories, but long term, it's not. It's about nutrient density. And also, I say the type of foods you eat determine how many calories you eat too. So there's a lot to it beyond nutrient density, why you can't just think about calories, because
Hmm.
you can't expect to just eat trash and not eat too much. So short-term thinking, instant gratification, that's like our whole culture now. And you're talking about the opposite of that. That's how you are successful. But how do you change? How do you get people to think long term when no one wants to do that? They want to just watch the next TikTok video.
Well, yeah, I can totally relate to what you're saying, and I think I'm lucky enough to spend my time surrounded by people coming to me because they want to move into this kind of lifestyle. So it's easy for me to forget that not everyone thinks about the things that I spend my life thinking about. Um, but what's fascinating to me is that there is a huge amount of younger. I mean, I'm educating anyone that's wanting to transition existing farms or whatever, but I'm not out to try and fix the system. I'm up, like, I know how to design effective farms and plan the economies and make it work. So I'm just focused on supporting the people who specifically come to me. I'm not shouting out and trying to change the bigger system
Yeah.
because I don't feel like that's an effective way to go with things. So I'm seeing a massive amount of people that want to go into this kind of lifestyle because they, like a lot of people in their 20s and early 30s, are either refusing to go into what would have been traditional jobs and roles, I guess, or are coming out of them pretty quickly because they're not fulfilled and they want a meaningful life or space to grow a family in, etc., which I think farming is particularly conducive for. Um, but in terms of customers too, I think that it's incredible the amount of people that are waking up to these things. I think podcasts are a massive part of that, and the change in media consumption. I think a lot of people are turning away from mainstream media and opening up to the
Yeah.
possibilities that we have on the internet. So that's changing things. And with social media and people's increasing online presence, I think everyone's getting exposed to, most people have an image in their head of what a factory chicken farm looks like everyone's seen that now. So it's
Yeah.
like you have to be pretty tuned out or lazy not to start thinking about, okay, so what's the alternatives? And I think there's different layers and levels in this, and it's really what I've focused on talking people through is really trying to dig into the core of these problems. Like I'll just break down an example. Like one example would be eggs. So eggs are produced by hybridized chickens nowadays all over the world. So they're not producing meat, they're producing eggs, and they will actually cannibalize their own bodies to keep laying eggs. That's how bred they are. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got industrial battery hens who don't go outside and live in their own fecal particulate dust, and you need a whole medical industry just to keep them alive in pretty archaic conditions. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got your free range eggs, and that's nice because the hens have access to outdoors, and you can then market your eggs in a green box with the sun going down on it, and
Yeah.
people are like, these must be good, and they turn brain off and just consume that. But there's another end to that spectrum. And so one thing I would invite people to consider is like free range is not good for hens, and it's not good for the nutrient consumption for those eggs, for you when you eat those eggs. If you go on these free tools that we have on our computers everywhere, like Google Earth, and you go and look at a free range chicken farm, you'll find a barn in the middle that never moves, surrounded by bare ground like soil, with a bit of grass around the outside of a paddock that there's no chickens on. And the chickens are they're protective. They stay close to their nest and they don't go too far. And because a chicken spends its day scratching two of its feet this way, two this way, peck, 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 looking for bugs, because they're omnivores, right? So one thing to say about that extreme in the battery farm is like often chickens are fed vegetarian diets, but chickens are omnivores by default,
Yeah.
right? When they're in that free range setting, they soon scratch the area around their housing to bare dirt. So there's no fresh green material that translates to vitamins and minerals, and there's no bugs. That's all their healthy omega content of the eggs. And so it's easy to greenwash the public with something like that. But what we learn by looking at nature is that animals are constantly on the move because they shit and urinate all over their food supply. So they have to be, or they have a predator following them around that controls a herd of large animals, etc. So there's a very, very big difference between, on one end of the spectrum, like very intensively indoor raised, then free range, which a lot of people today could still be forgiven for thinking that's a good egg. It's not a good egg for the consumer, and it's not a good egg for the chicken. It's just good for the farmer who can market that in a different way. When we start to move animals on a daily basis, copying how animals move in nature, they have a radical impact on the soil health, which turns back into much more nutrient dense grasses and forbs that can then be eaten by cattle or the chickens next time they come round. And you start to see the nutrient profile in truly pastured eggs is totally different. Like a third of the cholesterol and quarter of the saturated fats, loads more vitamin A, loads more vitamin E. There's been loads of peer reviewed studies on truly pastured egg production. The same with pastured meat chicken production or pastured beef or whatever it is. But I'm pointing this out because I think that there's always deeper you can dig into these things. So how do you change the mindset was your question. It's like, I don't know the answer, but I do know that when people start to get inquisitive themselves and start to go see these things in action and meet the farmers involved in these things and hear what they have to say, it opens up a whole world of fascination. So something I've always done at our farm since the beginning as a way to start building the customer base was run big farm tours, and they're open all day, and we'll give the whole day away and we'll feed people for free. But I'll be crawling around in cow paddies with ladies in their 80s who have never ever walked in the field with a cow before, let alone with their bare fingers opened up a cow paddy and looked at the different creatures in there and be told about what those creatures actually do and which ones are important and why. And they get fascinated, and little kids get fascinated by this. And I think the beauty of this kind of farm is that it's family friendly. Like, something that you probably have over in the States is most of the big farms have danger, this is a farm, keep out on the outside of the gate. Whereas we open up the farm gate and bring people in, and we start to really get them tantalized around the little creatures in the pasture and how they're supporting this whole system. And then we feed them. And then when you've eaten extremely fresh, high quality food, it's very hard for people to go back on. So when we started up with our pastured egg production here in these little eggmobiles that move every day, for months and months we had people on a daily basis sending us photographs of their fried eggs or their omelets, because they're just nothing like you can buy in the store. Like, the color and the flavor profile
Oh yeah.
is, you know.
Just bright orange. Yeah, I can't eat normal eggs. I love the your whole message about the free range and the greenwashing. It's like, oh, this is so great. No, it's not. No, it's not. And not to bring up Whole Foods again, because I actually don't even like Whole Foods. I don't even like going to these stores. You go into Whole Foods, it's all just a free range, all this stuff. You try any of those eggs, yellow yolks, don't taste like anything, garbage. Cannot eat them. I get mine from the farmer's market, from the people that do it right, move them, rich orange yolks. It's just a game changer. And so you're talking about making farming cool again. I was trying to make a shirt, make ranching cool again, make farming cool again. It needs to have a revolution. And part of that revolution is it has to be profitable. So maybe you could talk more about that, because it is. So I think it's the most rewarding thing you can do. I know a lot of people kind of in the health space that their goal is like, man, I want to get a ranch. I want to grow my own food. Like, this is something that people are after, they want. And
Yeah.
it should be, right? It should be what they want because it's rewarding. You're working with your hands. You're being very creative, actually. Like you said, they're not technicians. Technicians would just like plow a field. You have to be very creative and it takes a lot of ingenuity. Is what I'm trying to say here. To like come up with all these solutions, and you're solving problems, and it's like, okay, this needs this needs this, and it can be profitable as well. It's very rewarding, and I think the future is in having all of the farms around a city. So how we get there is by being profitable. So you talk a lot about that, and you help teach people how to do that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. And it's worth saying, you know, that food production used to be outside around the cities. In England, where I come from, you had night bargemen, and everyone had their outhouses at the bottom of the garden before. It's just like 100 years ago, and people would come around at night and collect this fertilizer to take up the river and put back on the fields that surrounded London and grew the food for the city. And you see more recent cases like in Havana, Cuba, or in the Second World War in London, places like this, where nearly 75% of food production came from within the city boundaries. There's so many unused green spaces in big cities and rooftops, etc. So there's a whole world of urban agriculture that I'm not really part of, but there's a lot of great work in that space. But yeah, I've been focused on mixed farming, as I said, and quite rural location. I think the most impressive thing about my farm is that I'm in the middle of nowhere. in a catchment. I think I sell all my products within 50 kilometers, and we can see about 100,000 people in that community. If you're on the outside of New York, or, there's a lot of famous regenerative farms that are in a totally different customer base that's, you could scale things to any degree there. I'm living in the middle of nowhere, and I want to sell things close to my farm, not because I have to, but it makes sense to use as little oil and transport as necessary to keep food fresh and local, but more from the point of, hey, you can come here, I'll teach you how to do this, and you can go set up 100 kilometers away, and then we can like spread out like this. But I focused a lot on data. I think when I came into this space, I think Joel Salatin was the only single person I could find in the whole world who was sharing models of how to do these things with time and financials included. That, like, this information doesn't exist anywhere. However, all of his information was like 20 years out of date.
Yeah.
And, he wrote a book called Pastured Poultry Profits, how to produce $20,000 on 20 acres in 6 months. But that's changed. My model is like I can produce $100,000 on 8 acres in 6 months. So it needed updating. So I'm just going to plug this because this is what we're talking about. This book I wrote is a manual of how to do this, focused on
Oh
the
wow.
economy. And
Big
that's a
thick
book I
book.
sell.
A lot of
It's
photos.
a it's a lot of photos and spreadsheets, and it breaks down all the finances of how to do. There's about 13 different enterprises, from poultry to vegetables to microgreens to indoor mushroom production, beef, micro dairies, lamb, whatever. And I'm just putting together a recipe book for, like, this is a really challenging thing to write because there are no standardized solutions when you're dealing with complexity. And so what do I mean by complexity? In system science, like, a complex system is one that's evolving in ways that we can't predict. And as a farmer, I have to deal with ecology, it's complex, society, it's complex, and economy, that's complex. So there is no such thing as a standardized solution. Like, I designed this eggmobile for pastured poultry that's quite famous, and hundreds of people have them around the world. But the point is, like, hey, you shouldn't copy this exact design. Here's why I designed it like this. You need to get clear why you're designing it the way you do, and it's the pattern that's important, not it should look like this. So I was very hesitant to write this book, but I saw that there was a massive need for it because a lot of people coming into this field that want to farm for a living, they need that starting point, because if you didn't grow up with farming, there's a million things you don't know. Like, farm kids, when they're 10, they can drive tractors, fix quad bikes, handle large animals like a bull, and know that they're safe. And for someone in their 20s coming out of the tech industry, starting a farm, it's like, I wouldn't want them near my bull. They're going to die. so
Yeah.
So I tried to, well, I thought a lot about this, and I kept massive amounts of records, and that's really helped put this together. And so it's specifically focused on the size of land you need to obtain a sort of decent income. And then it looks at the time you need to invest, the money you need to invest, and then what the overall economy looks like. And it's based on my work here in Sweden, but it's basically the same pattern language wherever you are. It's always more profitable to produce pastured meat chickens than it is to produce beef. But if you have loads of land and you have a ranch, it's not appropriate to have millions of chickens. So maybe you're a rancher. So I've put it as a recipe for, because what I noticed is a lot of people coming to me for advice would say, I've inherited the family farm and I'd like to grow vegetables. Or I have 10 hectares out the back of my house, I'd like to start a dairy. It's like, no, that doesn't work. It's like, you need to make an economy, you need at least this much. So it's trying to give people a perspective of, okay, I've got 50 acres and I've got $100,000 to invest. here's the three things you could do that would work if you wanted to make a living doing this, you know. So it's trying to orientate people to how to organize things in their heads that they can make an intelligent, smart go of it. And then obviously it's got a lot of info into the, you know, the ecological systems that we're working with and how to actually practically do these things on the ground. And it's been well received all over the world actually, and it's helping people literally start their businesses from scratch. And I think that the sharing of data and numbers has been critically important with that, and it's a big part of why our farm is well known in this space, is that we've just shared everything openly the whole time. And it's people need that, you know. It's like if you go through any business training, you need that basic understanding of how things work. And I think because the future of this type of farming relies on entrepreneurial and innovative folks who don't come from farming backgrounds necessarily, they need that sort of information to get started. Because it's like I always say to people, look, this is the most rewarding and beautiful lifestyle you could have, but it like running any business is pretty hard. Most small businesses fail, and there's no data on most small farm businesses. So it's like learning to farm is a pretty exponential learning curve, and running your own business is a pretty steep learning curve. So if you're trying to start a farming business and you've not done either of those things before, that's about as steep a learning curve as you could choose, I guess. So it's resources like this that we're really missing, I feel like, and that's what I dedicated many years to putting together.
It's great. It's great. It's called regenerative agriculture. I can link to it in the show notes. And I heard you say something. I loved it. Very rare that people choose to do something different before catastrophe, right?
Hmm.
Basically, people kind of wait till it's too late. And I mean, we kind of see that with COVID. People like are in poor health. They haven't cared about their health at all. And now we're understanding that these people are the ones that are dying because they haven't cared for their health at all, and they've just eaten bad foods and not ever exercised or whatever, and they're just sick.
Hmm.
So how does that relate to the like the food world or food production?
Well, I mean, it's heading in that same way, isn't it? And what people don't know all the time is that it's mass grain production that will be most affected by global weirding, I would call it, like changing weather patterns. You know, we don't know, you know, whatever's going on with global climate, what is definitely happening is freak weather events are happening more frequently. And the trouble with that is that it's agriculture that's most affected by that. Obvious reasons. If you're growing a grain crop on 10,000 hectares and you have a bad season, you get wiped out. Now, just 50 years ago, there were, 75% of world food was made up of maybe 8 or 9 different grains. Now, 95% of it is 3 or 4 grains. And they're found in 95% of every single product in the supermarket, in the store. So, one thing that will change very dramatically in, I would imagine, our lifetime is grain production, because it's so vulnerable to big changes in weather patterns. And most of the world's grain is grown in continental interiors like the United States or Russia, where changing weather patterns are already affecting. We saw a few years ago what happened in Russia affected global grain prices all over the world, and that's going to happen more and more, and food's going to get more and more expensive. I think farmers are like, what I see in my industry is that farmers are starting to change out of necessity, because the price of fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, is becoming extortionate. People can't afford to be buying that anymore. And it's killing their soils and producing poor nutrient density food as a result. But it's interesting. I can only find, and I'd love to hear from anyone that can find other examples, but I look back anthropologically, historically, I can only find 2 examples where humans were put into extremely adverse circumstances and actually banded together and cooperated. And you can if anyone's interested, they're both movies that you can find online. One is it's called The Power of Community. It's how Cuba survived peak oil. So basically, everyone in Havana had to start growing food, and if they didn't, the government took the land and gave it to someone who did, and they produced. When the embargoes were on, they were producing like the city's food right in the middle of the city, and everyone's now getting access to a lot more nutrient dense, fresh, lovely food. The other one is an incredible film. It's called The Coconut Revolution, and it's based around the island of Bougainville off East Timor, who were put under siege by the Australian and Papua New Guinea Defence Forces for 7 years, and became entirely self-sufficient on medicine, fuel, and food, and were still driving trucks around using coconut oil that they made themselves 7 years later. But they are the only two examples I can see in modern history where whole communities of people faced with absolute catastrophe actually totally radically transformed the societal norm. Um, and they're pretty interesting things to look at because psychologically, you know, what's clear from history is that people forced into difficult circumstances will tend to degrade back into their patterned based response, which in our cultures is armored patriarchy, which doesn't look pretty when people start not having enough resources to feed their kids and wife, etc. So it's a much bigger topic, but a very interesting one.
Well, you know what? I watched Coconut Revolution last night.
Did you?
Uh, yeah. Oh man, it's so cool. Yeah, was it made in like the late '90s? It's kind of this old documentary, 53 minutes. You can find it on Amazon Prime. Uh, yeah, very cool. I love that they were forced to do it. When humans are forced into something, or when the pressure's put on to survive, they figure it out. And it when that happens, you also go to the truth of things, the root cause of things, right? You don't use grains. They weren't just, oh, we're gonna monocrop. That wasn't their solution. That's the fake answer. What I'm saying is you go to the true answer. You go back to traditional methods, to ancestral traditions and knowledge. And that's what they did. Then they found out how to feed themselves, how to go back to, the way regenerative agriculture, basically. They went back to methods of medicine that their ancestors had, right? And they were using the herbs, and they were making salves and like fixing people's, wounds with the little pastes and stuff. It's just amazing that you go pretty much opposite from all the modern methods, and you have to go back to the ancestral methods when it's crunch time.
But I think, well, I could add to that. Like, I'm not a luddite by any means. I'm up for using as much technology and new thinking as
Oh yeah.
possible, like applied to the natural rhythm of things. So rather than thinking of it as an old-fashioned way of doing things or an ancestral way, I think because farming, let's face it, is probably only 10 to 14,000 years old. I personally believe it probably went way back beyond that, but that's as far back as we go so far. It's I think, like, by farming properly in a way that respects the natural physiology of animals, like raising our pigs in the forest, which is their natural habitat, or whatever it is, the natural corollaries or outcomes is all of the things that people are still patterned into trying to fix with technology. Like, to restore soils and ecosystems to prevent flash flooding is a natural consequence of farming correctly to produce good food, you know? So, of course, there's big systemic issues with lobbying, with subsidies, and it's not easy to change those things, and it's hard to say what the future will be. But all we can do is the bit we can do, and I think it's very encouraging to see more and more people focusing on their end as consumers, as well as an unprecedented amount of young folks who want to learn how to do this. And there are places like my farm, and there's many of farms like this around the world that are teaching a new generation of people how to do this properly and profitably for the well-being of their communities, and that's really what it's about.
It is, and back to the documentary, like they, well, okay, the systems are brittle or fragile that we have today. And there's no problems using technology as well. Yes, just because they didn't have technology, they were like reusing old parts, car parts sitting around, and they made like a hydroelectric power plant, and they did really cool stuff with technology, really. So there's no problem with using technology. You have to use it wisely to complement the ancestral methods, right? Absolutely. Yeah, we're not trying to be a Luddite here. We're not trying to like go back
Mm.
and live in a cave. It's like, how do we have the best of both worlds? And the worst of the world is doing these monocrop systems that are fragile, right? And that, yes, if there's a change in weather, like you said, there's a drought, everyone got screwed but you, because you were anti-fragile. You used the right systems and had the
Not
resiliency.
me. I mean, nature is anti-fragile. So if we
Well,
copy
yeah,
nature, yeah,
you got, that's what, yes, that's what it's all about, is copying nature. That's like kind of the ultimate solution. And nature thinks long term too, right? It's not a short term thing. It's not like you could just throw a band-aid on it, throw a pill, throw the fake fertilizer on it. That's never how nature works. You can't cheat nature in the
no, you
most
definitely
fundamental
can't.
things. You can, I mean, we can a little bit. I always say, yeah, I mean, yeah, we made an airplane, right? That's kind of cheating nature. But in the fundamental things of, well, specifically to being human and having human health, you can't cheat nature. You can't just like build a machine that works out for you. That's, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you have to do the workout. Like, that's the whole point, is you have to strain your muscle to get stronger. If you do the machine does it for you, you don't get stronger. You can't
And
build.
we can be having a joyous, fulfilling life in doing that. I'd love to tell a little story about the. There's a beautiful picture that encapsulates so much of what we're talking about right there in Texas. Can I? Do we have time for that?
Sure, absolutely. Let's do it.
Yeah. So we're in a world, I guess, where we talked about already. We like to fight symptoms, not core problems, and we are still trapped in the belief that we can use technology to fix what are biological problems. And we have some of the smartest people on the planet designing how to fly little mirrors into space to put into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight to influence global temperature changes, etc. And it's like the trouble when we're dealing with complexity and making decisions in the face of complexity is that unintended consequences are the normal reaction. And it's like, well, what could possibly go wrong with flying up these mirrors into space? And yet, this is some of the smartest brains on the planet being charged with this. And I want to just, for the viewers, I want to paint a picture of how the stupidity of thinking technology will fix biological problems sums up so beautifully in a Texan food lot where we have, and if you don't know, or if you haven't seen a Texan food lot where you have kilometers of cattle standing on hard ground, in often up to their knees in their own feces, and you've got constant semi trucks coming in with grain to feed to these animals. And it's worth pointing out, categorically, fundamentally, cattle didn't evolve to eat grain, not a single bit of it. They evolved to eat grass and herbs in the field. That's it. Sure, they get fat if you feed them grain, but they have very weird omega 3 6 balances and they make you sick. It's not good food or good milk that comes from an animal like that. So you've got this constant soil degrading grain production to bring semi trucks and this pollution problem to feed these animals something they never evolved to eat. And they're living in their own fecal matter. It's basically a medieval city that needs now constant streams of pharmaceutical drugs coming in to keep these animals alive. And for good measure, we're going to chuck growth hormones in and all these things and create this pride filled culture where if you can eat a 40-ounce steak, you get another one for free, and they'll stick a picture of you on the wall and all this. So, this sort of macho culture. And then on the other end of that, you've got this industrial scale pollution problem. But then what's happening over here next door in the desert is really interesting. So humans are trying to use technology to fix this biological problem. And we've created this machine called the desert imprinter. It's basically a massive cylindrical heavy drum with little metal points on it. And a big caterpillar uh, will pull it around the desert and leaving little imprints on the desert surface. And the reason they do that is that all of the dried grasses, as they blow around in the wind, little seeds will get stuck in those little depressions. And then when it rains, a little bit of moisture will go down in there, and little grass plants will stick out of these little depressions. And we congratulate ourselves and say, wow, look at this technology. We're solving this problem. But the problem is the solution. If you take those cattle out of those medieval conditions and put them in a literal little electric fence as a proxy for a predator species like wolves, lions, whatever it is, and move them around on those desertified grasslands, and obviously it's a little bit more to it than this, but that's essentially it. You can recreate annual grasses immediately, and within a few years, you can create perennial bunch grasslands, healthy, very very nutritionally dense human food, and a lot of jobs for farmers. And you can do away with that entire pollution problem, that entire grain production problem, and the pharmaceutical industry bit of it, and have pristine human food in a restored habitat. And there's a lot of people wanting access to land to do this exact kind of work and make a meaningful living. And I always find that's like a, a beautiful picture to just see these two systems working in the same space, and the sheer ignorance and oblivion going on there when the solution lies in the problem itself. And I can find examples of that all over the world in all ecosystems. And it's, yeah, I think what I'm excited to share and hope people can get inspired by is there's an incredible world of uh, understanding. Like ecological literacy is something missing from our schools, universities, etc., and particularly from our farmers' education. But it's a fascinating world where we learn to look at the world around us through a set of sort of pattern goggles where we can start to understand complexity. We're all taught at school in a way that's very foreign to how our brains actually learn. Like we can't regurgitate lists of things, or we don't even remember the heading on the newspaper that we saw yesterday. Our brains don't capture this information, but they are incredibly attuned to pattern languages. And you were saying you've been off to Africa with tribal folks. These are the sort of people that had incredibly intricate knowledge of their resource bases and never lived exceeding their natural resource bases. And they all stored their knowledge in song, dance, rhythm, these kind of pattern based languages. And that's been a massive part of my learning journey that I share a little bit in my book. Uh, Sort of undoing and deprogramming the education I got in England and learning to look at the world around me from a pattern perspective. And when I started to then study whole systems, it meant that if I studied how forest ecology worked, I would know how better to invest my money to make it work in an ecosystemic way, and I would learn how to use money more effectively. So everything feeding into itself, because they're all connected through patterns of how things grow and move in the universe. And it's maybe a little bit abstract here, but it's something I'd love to instill in people, is that there's a whole different way of accessing information that is aligned to how our brains actually learn. And I was lucky enough in my later schooling to be taught a lot about the actual process of learning, and to really dive deeply into very diverse fields that all actually interlink and tie together. And that's something I hope for my children, is that they will also benefit from learning holistically, which is not something schools, universities teach us, I'm afraid.
Well, you've opened a new can of worms that we can't get into, because I am
Sure.
very much in agreement. The school systems are a disaster. They're teaching memorization. They're not teaching critical thinking. This is insane. Yeah, we need to think of like the complexity. This is how, yeah, patterns, like you said, this is how the human brain is supposed to work. And I think it's a huge problem is that this hasn't been taught. So everyone is in this just simple-minded view of the world, memorization, all this type of stuff. It's the opposite of what we need to do. We need to go to the very top and look at entire ecosystems, and that's how things make sense. So, well, I'll leave it there for there. Also, I'm glad you brought up the whole Texas story. It's a great illustration of how bad it is. But I guess I'll throw in my plug. We are in Texas. Nose to Tail is my company, and we're doing things the right way. So, yes, you can drive through all the people doing it the wrong way, and then you can get to us up in Lubbock, and we have 4 ranching families that raise animals properly. They have the little egg mobiles, and the chicken mobiles that move every day. We're doing the regenerative ranching. We're using the fencing to, move the animals each day, restore the
Nice.
land. My ranch has actually been doing it since the late 80s when Alan Savory first started teaching way back in the day before he was, known at all. So, yeah, I'm doing that. I'm trying to make it profitable. It's hard. It's hard. And hopefully people will support it and basically support these 4 ranching families. So that's my plug for Nose to Tail. You can find it at
Nice.
nosetotale.org. But I want to plug Richard's book again, Regenerative Agriculture, and your YouTube channel. Is that the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, there's a lot of like if people are interested in how we actually run the farm, it's basically a vlog of me mostly walking around the farm, showing people what I'm up to, how I'm thinking, why I'm making decisions, and if people are interested in what running a farm looks like, that's a great place to go. And my book is available for anyone that wants to actually start a farm. It's a technical manual of how to start a farm and how ecosystem processes work. It's not really like casual reading. I'm not plugging it to people that aren't super interested in farming because it's like a university level textbook. It's not for casual reading, I would say.
Well, that's great because it's needed. And if you want more casual viewing, just watch his YouTube videos and you can pick and choose and find some stuff you're interested in. Thank you so much. I love this discussion. We covered, the diet side and the production side. So it's like the whole picture. I hope people send this to vegans. If you know someone who doesn't understand all this stuff, who needs to understand this is the future. When you get to the real truth of things, this is the truth, right? This is not the fake system of making Beyond Meat and having advertising and just this whole bogus system that we're in. This is the truth. This is how it works. I'm glad that you're living this life and helping people do it themselves. So, thanks, Richard. Take care.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for all you're doing, Brian.
All right.